The uniform still fit. That was the thing Marcus Harwell noticed every morning when he passed the closet where it hung, pressed and covered in dry cleaning plastic that his wife had stopped removing years ago because no one ever reached for what was underneath. 4 stars on each shoulder. Enough ribbons to wallpaper a small room. The fabric held the shape of the man he had been, even when the man himself had begun to soften at the edges in ways he would never have permitted in a subordinate. He stood at the kitchen window of the house in Arlington, watching the sun come up over the back garden, the way he had watched it come up over Kandahar, over Ramstein, over the South China Sea from the deck of a carrier that answered to his voice. The sun had never failed to report for duty. He respected that about it. Behind him, the coffee maker clicked and hissed. Somewhere above him, his daughter was sleeping. His daughter, who had not seen a sunrise in 12 years. Marcus Harwell had commanded 17,000 soldiers through a theater of operations that spanned 4 time zones. He had buried 9 men and women under his direct authority and had written letters to each of their families in his own hand, because that was what you did when the cost of your decisions came home in a box draped with a flag. He had never once used the word impossible in a briefing, because impossible was a word that made people stop thinking, and people who stopped thinking got other people killed. But the doctors had used that word, 14 of them, across 12 years, in 7 cities, in language that varied only in its degree of gentleness. The scans were conclusive. The nerve damage was complete. The visual cortex showed no functional activity. The prognosis was unchanged, irreversible. He had sat through each of those appointments the way he sat through intelligence briefings that carried bad news. Spine straight, hand still, face arranged into the expression of a man who was receiving information rather than absorbing a blow. Elena beside him, her fingers light on his forearm, her posture a mirror of his own because she had learned stillness from the same source she had learned everything else. She never cried in those offices. Neither did he. They saved that for the car, where the leather seats and the tinted windows created something close enough to privacy. And even then, it was quiet. A breath held too long. A hand squeezed once and released. The coffee maker finished. He poured 1 cup, black, no sugar. He poured a second with 2 sugars and a measure of cream that he had long ago stopped needing to think about. He set the second cup on a small wooden tray alongside a glass of water and a bottle of eye drops that did nothing medically useful, but that Elena said made her feel like the morning had a structure. The tray was oak. He had made it himself during the first year of her blindness, when his hands needed something to do that was not calling another specialist or reading another journal article he could not fully understand. The edges were sanded smooth. The center had a shallow groove where the cup sat without sliding. It was the most precisely constructed object in a house full of military memorabilia, because it was the only one he had built for her. He carried it upstairs. Her door was open 3 inches, the way she kept it. Not closed, because closed meant sealed, and sealed meant something she could not get out of. Not open, because open meant exposed. 3 inches was the width of a voice carrying through without effort. He had never measured it. He knew it exactly. He pushed the door with his shoulder and stepped inside, and the morning light from her east-facing window fell across the bed where his daughter lay sleeping. Her face turned toward the glass, toward the sun she could not see. He set the tray down on the nightstand, and the oak made a small, familiar sound against the wood, and he stood there for a moment in the quiet of a war he did not know how to win. The fever arrived on a Tuesday in March, the way most catastrophes arrive, without announcement, without mercy, and in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Elena Harwell was 4 years old. She'd been playing in the garden behind the family's quarters at Fort Belvoir, pulling dandelions from the grass and lining them up along the porch steps like tiny soldiers standing at attention. Her mother, Catherine, watched from the kitchen window while washing dishes, glancing up every few seconds the way mothers do when the world is still small enough to monitor from a single room. By 3 o'clock, Eleanor was warm. By 5, she was burning. The base physician diagnosed a viral infection and prescribed fluids and rest. General Harwell was in Stuttgart that week, 3 time zones and an ocean away, receiving updates by phone in a concrete corridor outside a NATO briefing room. Catherine held the phone to Elena's ear so she could hear his voice. Elena asked him to bring her something green from Germany. She liked green. It was her favorite color that month. By Thursday, the fever had not broken. It had climbed. Elena stopped asking for things. She stopped asking for anything at all. Her eyes, which had always been restless and curious, tracking birds and bugs, and the movement of light across ceilings, began to drift. Catherine noticed it the way you notice a clock that has stopped. Not immediately, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The transfer to Walter Reed happened Friday morning. General Harwell landed at Andrews Air Force Base 4 hours later, still wearing his dress uniform, and walked into the pediatric neurology ward smelling of aircraft fuel and coffee. He found his daughter in a bed that seemed engineered to make a 4-year-old look even smaller than she was. Wires ran from adhesive patches on her temples to a monitor that translated her brain's electrical activity into jagged green lines on a black screen. The neurologist on duty was a lieutenant colonel named Faris, who had the particular steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering news that would rearrange the architecture of other people's lives. The inflammation had crossed into the central nervous system. It had settled, with what seemed like deliberate cruelty, along the optic pathways. The myelin sheathing that protected the nerve fibers was being stripped away by Elena's own immune response, her body mistaking the tissue for an invader and attacking it with the same blind efficiency her father had spent his career studying in enemy combatants. They brought the inflammation under control within 72 hours. The infectious disease team called it a success. Lieutenant Colonel Faris did not use that word. The scans told the rest of the story. Both optic nerves showed severe demyelination. The visual evoked potential test, which measured whether electrical signals from the eyes were reaching the brain, returned results so flat they were almost indistinguishable from the baseline noise of the equipment itself. General Harwell asked the question every parent asks. He asked it standing at full height, shoulders squared, as though the answer might be something he could outrank. What does this mean for her vision? Faris did not look away. That was the one kindness he could offer. The damage is extensive, General. Based on what we're seeing, the likelihood of functional visual recovery is extremely low. Harwell stood there for a long moment. The monitor beside Elena's bed beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Down the hall, someone laughed at something, the sound obscenely normal. He asked the question again 6 months later to a different specialist. Then again, the following year. Then again. 14 times over 12 years, in hospitals and clinics and research centers across 4 states. He asked the same question in different words, and 14 times the answer came back wearing the same face. Irreversible. The word became a wall, and Marcus Harwell was not a man who knew how to stop walking toward walls. Dana Cho had learned to listen before she learned to speak. Her mother, a Korean immigrant who cleaned offices in downtown Baltimore, used to say that the world tells you everything it needs to if you stop filling it with your own noise. Dana was 4 years old when she understood what that meant. She was 33 when it saved a girl's life. 9 years in pediatric neurology had taught her things that no textbook could hold. She had learned that children lie about pain, not because they are brave, but because they are terrified that naming it will make it permanent. She had learned that the space between a parent's question and a doctor's answer contains more information than the answer itself. She had learned that the most important symptom is almost always the one nobody asks about. She was assigned to Eleanor Harwell's case on a Tuesday in October. The file arrived before the patient did, the way files always do, and Dana read it the way she read every file, which is to say, completely, and then again, with suspicion. 16-year-old female. Bilateral optic nerve damage secondary to inflammatory encephalitis at age 4. No light perception. 14 specialist consultations across 12 years. Prognosis unchanged. The word unchanged appeared 6 times in the clinical history. Dana circled it each time. Not because she doubted the physicians who had written it, but because in her experience, unchanged was a word that described the conclusion. It rarely described the patient. Eleanor arrived at the Brennan Institute on a Wednesday afternoon, with her father beside her and a posture that Dana recognized immediately. It was the posture of someone who had been examined so many times that their body had learned to prearrange itself for observation. Chin slightly lifted, hands still in her lap, eyes open and directed forward at nothing, because she had been told since childhood that people found it easier to talk to her when she appeared to be looking at them. Dana did not introduce herself with her title. She said her name, and then she said nothing for a while. She adjusted the IV line. She checked the monitors. She let the room be quiet long enough for quiet to stop feeling like a test. On the first evening, while Eleanor's father was downstairs making calls in the voice he used when he did not want his daughter to hear the worry in it, Dana sat in the chair beside Eleanor's bed and asked the question she asked every patient who had lived inside a diagnosis longer than they had lived outside one. Do you ever notice anything that does not match what you have been told about your condition? She did not phrase it as a challenge. She did not phrase it as hope. She phrased it the way her mother would have phrased it, as an invitation to say the unsaid thing. Eleanor's hands moved in her lap, the left thumb pressed against the right palm. Dana watched the pressure increase and then release. Sometimes, Eleanor said, when I wake up, just for a second, like static on a screen that is almost tuned to something. Dana did not react with her voice. She reached for the small notebook she kept in her scrub pocket, the one with the blue cover that was soft at the corners from years of use, and she wrote down exactly what Eleanor had said. Word for word. She underlined static. She underlined almost. Then she asked a second question, one that mattered more than the first. How long have you been noticing that? Eleanor was quiet for a long time, long enough that most people would have repeated the question or assumed she had not heard it. Dana waited. Since I was maybe 12, Eleanor said. I told a doctor once. He said it was just my brain remembering what light used to look like. Dana wrote that down too, and beside it, in handwriting so small that only she would ever be able to read it, she wrote a single word. Wrong. The room was never fully silent. Eleanor had learned that years ago the way blind children learn everything, through the education of other senses pressed into service for the one that had abandoned them. There was always the hum of the building's ventilation system, a low mechanical breath that lived in the walls. There was the tick of the clock above the door, which she knew was above the door because she had asked once and never forgotten. There was the particular sound her bedsheets made when she shifted her weight, a whisper of cotton against cotton that had become the soundtrack of 10,000 restless nights. But the static was different. It did not come from the room. It came from somewhere behind her eyes, from the place where sight used to live, and it arrived without warning and without pattern. She had stopped mentioning it to doctors years ago. The first few times she had tried to describe it, she had watched their voices change, not the words, but the texture of them, the careful, measured tone adults used when they were deciding whether a child was confused or simply desperate. She learned to keep it to herself the way she had learned to keep a lot of things to herself. The loneliness of blindness was not the darkness. It was the things you stopped saying because no one had a place to put them. Tonight the static was there again. She lay on her back in the institute bed, the sheets pulled to her sternum, her hands resting on top of them, the way her mother had taught her when she was small. Hands where you can feel them, her mother used to say. It helps you know where you are. Elena had never stopped doing it, even after she understood that the advice had been born from her mother's fear, not her own need. The static pulsed. Not light. She would not call it light, because she had learned that calling it light made people uncomfortable, made them think she was imagining things, or worse, that she was performing hope for her father's benefit. It was more like the memory of light, the ghost of a signal trying to reach a receiver that everyone had declared broken. She turned her head on the pillow, toward the window. She did not know she was doing it. The movement was small, automatic, the kind of thing a body does when the conscious mind is not paying attention. Her face angled 3 degrees to the left, toward the place where the city's ambient glow pressed against the glass. She could not see it. She had never been able to see it, but something in her, something beneath language, beneath diagnosis, beneath 12 years of the word irreversible, responded to it the way a hand responds to warmth held close, but not quite touching. She thought about what the nurse had asked her. Do you ever see anything? Even something that doesn't make sense? 9 years of medical professionals, and not one of them had asked the question that way. They had asked whether her vision had changed. They had asked her to describe her visual field. They had used words that assumed the answer before the question was finished. Dana Cho had asked it the way you ask someone whether they hear music in another room, not whether the music exists, but whether they hear it. Elena had answered honestly for the first time in years. The static flickered. A pulse behind the darkness, formless and brief, like a match struck in a room she could not enter. It lasted less than a second. It meant nothing to any scan that had ever been performed on her. It would not register on any chart, would not survive translation into the language of medical reports and clinical assessments. But it was there. She kept her face turned toward the window and let the ghost of the signal wash over her. This thing that was not light and not nothing. This impossible whisper from a system the world had declared dead. She did not move until morning. Dana spent 3 days building her case before she said a word to anyone who could dismiss it. She started with the observation logs. Every shift, she noted the time, the light source, and Elena's orientation. She used a simple shorthand she had developed during her years in pediatric neurology, a personal notation system that no one had ever asked her to create, and no one had ever told her to stop using. Timestamp, light origin, patient head position, degree of turn, duration. By the end of the second day, she had 47 entries. 43 of them showed the same thing. Elena Harwell, a patient with a 12-year diagnosis of zero light perception, was tracking light sources with the quiet, involuntary precision of someone whose visual system had not entirely surrendered. 4 entries showed no response. Dana noted those too. She noted the times. All 4 occurred between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, when Elena was deepest in sleep, and the only light source was the dim amber glow of the hallway filtering under the door. Insufficient stimulus. Not contradictory data. Context. She did not tell Elena what she was doing. She did not want expectation to contaminate the responses. She hated that she had to think that way about a 16-year-old girl who had already been failed by enough clinical detachment to last several lifetimes. But the work required it. If this was going to mean anything to anyone beyond Dana Cho and her shorthand notebook, it had to be clean. On the 3rd morning, she brought the logs to Dr. Raymond Osei. His office smelled the way it always did, like cold coffee and the faintly sweet chemical scent of the hand sanitizer he kept in 3 separate dispensers around the room. He was reviewing imaging files on a dual monitor setup. when Dana knocked on the open door. He did not look up immediately. She waited. She had learned years ago that the physicians who made you wait before looking up were often the ones most worth waiting for. When he turned, she set the notebook on the edge of his desk and opened it to the first page of entries. She did not editorialize. She did not say what she thought it meant. She showed him the data and let the pattern speak. Osei read the first page, then the second. His index finger traced down the columns the way she had seen him trace imaging scans, with a pressure that suggested he was not just reading, but weighing. He turned to the third page and stopped at entry 31, where Elena had turned 11 degrees toward a pen light Dana had positioned at the periphery of her left visual field during a routine check. He looked up. "She's not conscious of this." "No, you're certain." "I positioned the sources without verbal cues. No contact, no sound indicators. 3 of the entries were recorded while she was mid-conversation with her father on the phone. She turned toward the window while talking about a book she was listening to. She had no reason to orient that direction." Osei closed the notebook. He did not hand it back. He set it beside his keyboard and placed one hand flat on the cover, the way people touch things they are not ready to let go of. "The existing VEP results are unambiguous," he said. "The cortical response is negligible." "I know. If you're right about what this suggests, then something is responding that the standard battery isn't measuring." Dana said nothing. She had already arrived at that conclusion 60 hours ago, sitting in the dim light of Elena's room at 1 in the morning, watching a sleeping girl turn her face toward a hallway that glowed the color of weak tea. Osei pulled his chair closer to the desk and opened Elena's digital file. The blue light of the monitor caught the lines around his eyes. "I want to run chromatic pupillometry," he said, "and I want you in the room when we do it." Dana picked up her notebook from his desk and held it against her chest. Her hands were steady. Everything else was not. The chromatic pupillometer arrived on a Tuesday, packed in a foam-lined case that Dr. Osei carried into examination room 3 himself. Dana had seen him delegate nearly everything in the 2 weeks she had worked alongside him. Chart reviews, patient callbacks, even the preliminary write-up of Elena's behavioral assessment. But this he carried with both hands, setting it on the counter with the particular care of a man who understood that the next 40 minutes would either validate a theory or bury it. Elena sat in the examination chair with her hands folded in her lap. She had been through enough tests in her 16 years to know the choreography by heart. The dimmed room, the instruction to hold still, the silence that always followed, heavy with the weight of someone else deciding what her eyes could or could not do. General Harwell stood against the far wall. He had not spoken since entering the room. Dana noticed his hands, clasped behind his back in a posture she had come to recognize as the one he assumed when he was bracing for something he could not control. Dr. Osei explained the procedure in the same measured tone he used for everything. Chromatic pupillometry isolated specific wavelengths of light, blue, then red, and measured the pupillary response at each. Unlike a standard light reflex test, which assessed the gross function of the optic nerve, this tool could detect activity in a subset of retinal cells that operated independently of the primary visual pathway. Intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, IPRGCs, cells that did not process images but responded to light itself. Cells that every previous test had never specifically looked for. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "So you're not testing whether I can see?" "No," Dr. Osei said. "I'm testing whether part of your retina is still listening." The room went dark, not the dimmed for examination dark that Elena was accustomed to, but a total clinical blackness that made even Dana hold her breath for a moment. The pupillometer's positioning arm extended toward Elena's right eye. A faint mechanical hum filled the silence. The first stimulus was blue light. 480 nanometers. Dana watched the monitor from her station beside the door, her pen motionless above her clipboard. The pupil contracted, not dramatically, not the way a healthy eye snaps shut against sudden brightness, but measurably, specifically, a response that had no business being there if the optic nerve damage was as total as 12 years of records insisted it was. Dr. Osei said nothing. He switched to red light, 620 nanometers. The pupil held steady. No response. He returned to blue. The contraction returned, small, consistent, reproducible. Dana looked at the general. His hands had come unclasped. One of them was pressed flat against the wall behind him, fingers spread, as though the room had shifted beneath his feet, and he needed something solid to confirm it had not. Dr. Osei ran the sequence 4 more times. Blue, contract, red, nothing, blue, contract, red, nothing. Each repetition tightened something in the room that Dana could not name but could feel in her sternum. He turned the lights on. Elena blinked, and the blink itself was a kind of evidence, the involuntary flinch of a system that was not supposed to be registering the change. Her IPRGCs are functional, Dr. Osei said. He was speaking to Dana but looking at the monitor as though he needed to read the numbers one more time before trusting his own voice. The non-image forming pathway is intact. It's been intact. Every scan she's ever had was looking at the wrong layer. Elena sat very still. What does that mean? Dr. Osei turned to her. For the first time since Dana had known him, he paused before answering a clinical question. Not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer was too large to deliver in the language he was accustomed to using. It means we've been reading the map wrong, he said. And there may be roads no one told you were there. Behind him, General Harwell's hand slid slowly down the wall to his side. He did not speak. He did not need to. The sound he made was barely audible, a single exhaled breath that carried 12 years of weight with it. The cells were there. That was the part that kept repeating in Dr. Osei's mind as he sat in his office at 11 o'clock at night. The chromatic pupillometry results spread across his desk like a confession the universe had been holding back for 12 years. Intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, IPRGCs, a small, stubborn population of neurons that had no business surviving the inflammatory cascade that had torn through Eleanor Harwell's visual system when she was 4 years old. The fever had burned through her optic nerves like a brush fire through dry timber, and every scan since had confirmed the devastation. Every specialist had looked at the wreckage and written the same word in the same confident hand. Irreversible. But these cells had not read the reports. They had survived in the margins, in the neural equivalent of a root system beneath scorched earth. Not the cells responsible for image formation, not the ones that would have let Elena see her father's face, or read a book, or watch the sunset over the Chesapeake. These were more primitive than that, more ancient. They belonged to a visual pathway that predated conscious sight itself, a system designed not to create pictures, but to detect the simple, fundamental presence of light, and they were firing. Dr. Osei pulled up the pupillometry data for the 4th time. The blue light stimulus at 482 nanometers had produced a sustained pupillary constriction that lasted well beyond the offset of the light. That response did not come from rods. It did not come from cones. It came from IPRGCs, and it meant that somewhere in the ruin of Elena's visual system, a small number of cells had been doing their job quietly, without recognition, for over a decade. Dana Cho's observation made sense now. The turning toward light, the static on waking. Elena's visual system was not dead. It was whispering, and no one had thought to listen at the right frequency. He picked up his phone and called Dana. She answered on the 2nd ring, which told him she had not been sleeping either. The IPRGCs are intact, he said. A subset, small but measurable. The non-image forming pathway has residual function. Silence on the line. Then Dana's voice, steady and precise in the way he had come to respect. What does that mean for her? Practically, it means the original diagnosis was incomplete. Not wrong in its conclusions about image-forming vision, but incomplete. No one tested for non-image-forming pathway function, because no one had reason to suspect it survived. The inflammation was so extensive that the assumption of total nerve death was clinically reasonable. But it was wrong. It was incomplete, he said again, because the distinction mattered. 12 years of specialists had not been negligent. They had been working within the limits of the tools and assumptions available to them. Chromatic pupillometry had not been standard protocol for pediatric optic nerve damage cases a decade ago. The understanding of IPRGC resilience in post-inflammatory conditions was still emerging in the literature. The cells had survived not because medicine had failed Elena, but because biology had done something medicine had not yet learned to look for. There were experimental protocols, Dr. Osi said. Neuroprotective therapies targeting surviving retinal ganglion cells. Gene therapy approaches for optic nerve regeneration that are in phase 2 trials. None of them would have been appropriate before because the assumption was that there was nothing left to protect. He paused. Now there is. Dana sat with that for a long moment. She thought about Eleanor in the morning light, her face tilted toward the window, her body knowing something that her medical record denied. When do we tell her? Tomorrow. Together. And we tell the general. Dana set the phone down. She looked at the notes she had written on her first evening with Elena. The ones that started with a simple question and a pause that lasted just long enough to matter. Sometimes the most important thing a cell can do is refuse to die. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is notice. The morning Dana Cho walked into Elena's room for the final evaluation, the blinds were already open. Not by staff, not by routine. Elena had crossed the room herself sometime before dawn and pulled the cord, and she was sitting in the chair by the window with her face tilted toward the east, her bare feet flat on the cold linoleum, her hands resting on her knees like someone waiting for a train she'd been told would never come. Dana stood in the doorway and did not speak. She had learned by now that the most important moments in Elena's life arrived in silence, and she was not going to be the one to break this one. Dr. Ose had scheduled the chromatic pupillometry session for 8 o'clock. The equipment had been calibrated the night before. The protocol was set. But what Dana was watching now was not a protocol. It was a 16-year-old girl sitting in a square of November sunlight, with her eyes open, and the tears running down her face were not from pain. They were from color, not full color. Not the saturated world Elena remembered from before the fever stole it. What the IPRGC pathway was delivering to her brain was something more primitive and more profound than that. It was the difference between light and dark. It was the warmth of amber through closed eyelids, made real and external and directional. It was the knowledge, felt in the body before it was processed by the mind, that the sun was there and that she could find it. Dana set her clipboard on the counter. She crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, and she did what she had done on that first evening 9 days ago. She asked the question, "What do you see?" Eleanor's breath caught. Her fingers curled against her kneecaps, pressing down the way her father pressed his palms flat on a table when the world was too large to hold any other way. "It's not static anymore," she said. Dana waited. "It's warm." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "It moves. When the cloud goes over, it dims, and then it comes back." She turned her face toward Dana, and even though the pathway carrying this information was not the one that would let her see Dana's face, or the room, or the color of the scrubs Dana was wearing, something in her expression had changed. The geography of her attention had shifted. She was no longer listening for the world. She was reaching toward it. "It comes back," Elena said again, And this time it was not a description. It was the first thing she had believed in 12 years. General Marcus Harwell arrived at the Institute at 1100 hours. He came in uniform because he did not know how else to come to something this important. Dana met him in the corridor outside Eleanor's room and told him what the chromatic pupillometry had confirmed. She used the precise language. She explained the retinal ganglion cells, the non-image forming pathway, the difference between what Eleanor could perceive now and what future intervention might expand. She told him that the word irreversible, the word he had carried like shrapnel for 12 years, had been wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong enough to matter. The general listened the way he listened to field reports that carried casualties, still, absorbing, his jaw set and his hands flat against his thighs. Then he asked if he could see his daughter. Dana opened the door. Elena was still by the window. The sun had shifted and the square of light had moved across the floor, and she had moved with it, pulling the chair 6 inches to the left so she could stay inside it. When the door opened, she turned, and she did not see her father's face. She would not see his face for a long time yet, if ever. But she saw the shadow of him cross the light, and she reached for it. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hand, and neither of them spoke, and the light held.